Welcome to the Unit 1 summative task of AP World History. In this video, I'll be demonstrating my understanding on the unit through explaining contextualization, argumentation, comparison, causation, continuity, and change. The Kingdom of Axum and the introduction of Christianity. The Kingdom of Axum played a key role in the emergence of Christianity in sub-Saharan Africa and later on all of Africa as a whole. It was located on the highlands of modern Ethiopia. The first Axumite converts that converted to Christianity were merchants who traded in the Mediterranean cities that were nearby Ethiopia. And Christianity spiked up in Africa since then when the king of Axum himself converted. He did this as an act of diplomacy to strengthen relationships with Christian-ruled Egypt at the time. Even Ethiopian scholars translated the Bible to Ethiopian, and this was an act that was done to encourage the government in Ethiopia to convert to Christianity. The hemispheric economy of China during the Song Dynasty. At its peak, the Song Dynasty traded heavily and promoted the economy through that. Evidence that China had a hemispheric economy during this period is that the Song Dynasty was very highly productive and lasted much longer than any other dynasty China has ever had. When thinking of the Song Dynasty to make a connection, consider thinking of Baghdad during the Golden Age of Islam. It was something of the same might. The Chinese people were high consumers, and they had a desire for all exotic goods and entertainment. And this was also parallel to urbanization, and this desire for exotic goods, it spread mainly in the eastern hemisphere of China, resulting in a newly formed way of life. Cities grew and the number of people spiked. And of course, examples of some of these innovations that contributed to a hemispheric economy in China are paper money, tea, and gunpowder. Influences of Persian, Greek, and Indian societies on the culture and politics of Darul Islam. The Abbasid dynasty made countless efforts to exchange knowledge with other cultures. An example of this is the foreign scholars from all over the world that were constantly invited to Baghdad to meet with Islamic scholars. During the Golden Age of Islam, under the Abbasid rule, of course, the constant occurrences of discoveries left room for improvement in multiple areas, such as mathematics, literacy, and the sciences. From the Greeks, Muslim scholars learned about philosophy and rational thought of the world. The view of the Greeks on math laid a strong foundation for multiple medical discoveries in the Islamic world as well. The Persians, however, were most useful in areas regarding administration and kingship. As one knows, the Abbasid administration was the primary reason that the empire lasted for such a long time, so such influence on political thought was very significant. When it comes to Indian scholars, they taught the Muslim scholars their Hindu numerals. This led to advancements in trigonometry, algebra, and geometry. To what extent did the Tang dynasty owe its success to the Sui dynasty? If you don't know, the Sui dynasty lasted for 37 years, so obviously they did something wrong, right? Wrong. You shouldn't be thinking that way, because the Sui dynasty had multiple breakthroughs that actually influenced the Tang dynasty, which then led to the success of the Tang dynasty, which lasted 8 times longer than the Sui dynasty, from 618 CE to circa 907 CE. The first thing that the Sui dynasty influenced the Tang dynasty in is that they created the foundation for the bureaucracy system that was based on merit rather than aristocracy. This was, of course, a huge step up for the bureaucracy of China because at first, bureaucrats were employed based on nothing else but their social class. This created, of course, corruption within the bureaucracy, and it created resentment from those who knew that they could have done a better job than those who could just afford tutors. And there, the bureaucracy of merit was created. Secondly was the distribution of land according to the equal field system. This system was a system designed to where every individual and every family would get a certain amount of land based on the amount of labor they can supply in it. Even slaves at some point had a certain degree of land in the country, which was very fair for everyone. The third point is pretty self-explanatory, which was the maintenance of a properly developed system of communication and transportation. The Indian Ocean created routes that made the first signs of networks evident in the world. Well, kind of. We have to consider the Silk Road and, of course, trans-Saharan trade and all types of trade that were inside the continent. However, this was the first time a network that was created around the entire globe, known as a global network. The most prominent effect that maritime trade had, which means trade over the oceans, in this case the Indian Ocean basin. The most prominent example of the effect that it had was that there was a presence of Arabs in East Asia, and then there was also a presence of Chinese merchants in Southeast Asia. And of course, when we have documentation showing us that these people existed in these certain places at such times, it shows how that the transportation that enabled them to do so was probably the most effective tool of transportation or of trade. And essentially, to answer this question, what makes it more effective than trans Saharan trade is that it wasn't geographically limited. In a sense, trans Saharan trade was limited by its geography and it wasn't even that practical. When we think of the tools used on trans Saharan trade, it was nothing but camels and caravans. However, using the Indian Ocean basin as a tool of building a global network, you could see trade using ships, which enabled merchants to use and load more items and cover longer distances. And at some point, the ships could even take the capacity of over 1,000 tons. Smaller ships could take about 300. Let's go back to the idea of global networks to prove why the Indian Ocean basin was more effective than trans Saharan trade. Well, we could look at the exchange of ideas. And what made the trans Saharan trade very limited, as we said, was because it is very geographically limited. Even if goods were exchanged across the entire continent, north to south or east to west, at the end it was limited to only Africa and only the sub Saharan area. Sure, it was to a certain degree a tool of exchanging ideas, but however, it was very limited. And again, the evidence we saw of Chinese merchants being found in Southeast Asia or Arabs in East Asia overseas, or even explorers such as Marco Polo or Ibn Battuta, their documentations of their voyages prove are actual physical evidence that the Indian Ocean basin was more effective than the trans Saharan trade, to a very wide extent, even. What were the reasons behind the rapid conversion to Islam in conquered countries? Well, the spread of Islam was rapid, and we already know that. However, what could come as a surprise to some people is the willingness of the conquered people in these lands to convert, and that was due to a vast array of reasons. Well, for starters, people in these countries that were conquered by the Islamic Empire were oppressed. When we look at the Byzantine Empire or the Persian empires, people there were openly willing to allow a religion, a new religion that they could follow, which was reformed because it was a new system. To them, the idea of a strong empire that overpowered their own and proof to that is that there weren't even large amounts of military losses during the conquests of the empires that the Islamic Empire conquered. And that proves to show how powerful they were. So when people saw that they were these huge empires conquering them with new religions that brought ideas of equality for all, it was appealing to them. And it wasn't really something that they were willing to go against. It's actually the opposite of that. They were willing to let go of their current religion and the current system because it promised a new way of life. However, one must recognize that the key factor behind these rapid conversions to Islam by the conquered people in these lands were the missionaries. Whether we're looking at the Sufi missionaries or the normal military missionaries, missionaries were not necessarily forcing people to convert to Islam, which is what made it such a beautiful religion to those who were oppressed at the time. Like, if you could imagine these missionaries conquering your land with no losses in the military, and you see this new system that is reformed and gives you equality, and then you're being told that in this Dar al Islam, not Dar al Harb, where it's the foreign countries, but Dar al Islam, the countries that are under the control of Islam, where you could go and you could be appointed as a government official or a doctor or even a scholar while you're not a Muslim, that was appealing, and this is why it led to the rapid conversion of Islam. So Islam did not only rapidly spread, but the people that were conquered rapidly converted to Islam. Urbanization in East Asia. Major cities in East Asia grew because of increased food production and, of course, an increased population. And with the increase of a population, cities had to be urbanized, and one of the best examples is China. China was an immensely populated country. Near the end of the Song dynasty, around the late 1200s, China had one of the largest populations in the entire world. With a large amount of people came accommodation, and came exotic goods. Like we said, in the Song dynasty, people enjoyed purchasing exotic goods and entertainment. But those weren't the only things that were there in China at the time, or East Asia in general. There were hundreds of restaurants in each major city. Shops and stores open for the public. Local life just took a faster pace. And with that, more citizens, they had more responsibilities, obviously, and this led to innovations of all sorts, including printing, advanced agricultural techniques, and the use of porcelain. And this continuity can even be compared to Dar Islam, where at the same time, at the peak of the Golden Age during the Abbasid administration, you could see innovation occur. And this is not a coincidence, it's a pattern. In East Asia, even with this urbanization, came the emergence of commercialized agricultural economies, which caused the successfulness of China when it came to urbanization. An example of that is the fast ripening rice, or the champa rice, which introduced a whole new era of bountiful harvests and regional crop specialization. So these things could just be observed about China during the time, or East Asia in general during the time. Urbanization was key, and it led to its continuity. This slide relates very much to the first time we discussed the Indian Ocean Basin, so I won't get into very much detail about that because we're trying to avoid repetition here. However, the trade routes along the Indian Ocean Basin, they did boost India's economy primarily because India had a major geographical advantage of being in between the ports. From the coastal lines, it was very well developed. It had very advanced ports in every major stopping point. And this was obviously the cause of a boost in the global network created because cross-cultural trade was more occurring due to these, in quotes, maritime Silk Roads, which is what the Indian Ocean Basin is sometimes described as. We're essentially looking at the political organization of societies in sub-Saharan Africa because it provides an explanation that proves that this political organization was the main cause behind the economic development that occurred in sub-Saharan Africa as a whole, where leaders were capable of controlling the trans-Saharan trade and later maritime trade when the Swahilis emerged. And essentially, this political organization in sub-Saharan Africa was mostly a segmentary society where in most of its history there was cross-cultural interaction due to the fact that sub-Saharan city-states such as Congo or Mali or Kilwa were defined kin-based societies. This kin-based system in Congo, for example, consisted of a king and his group of his officials, and then this government oversaw military, judicial, and financial affairs. And there were 6 administrations below the central government. So as you can see here, there's a very specified distribution of power within each city-state, and when those work in harmony, they've deemed to be more effective in sub-Saharan Africa because when they do work in harmony, it's more effective than centralized rule because it boosts the economy as leaders are more capable of controlling these specific areas, as opposed to one emperor losing control over all his lands when it stretches as big as the sub-Saharan African societies, because over here we can see as it stretches from the north of Africa all the way to the south. It would have been impossible to control with one centralized emperor, which is why, of course, the economy was developed through these regional leaders. During the centuries after the Han Dynasty, where we can see here we have the Qin Dynasty and then the Han Dynasty, together they didn't last for such a long time, we could tell here. After the Han Dynasty following the Han Dynasty, there were several regional kingdoms, and it was all during a time of uncertainty. There were bids made for these kingdoms to assert their authority over everyone else and to cover the entire land of China. But of course, no one had the resources to dominate whatever rivals they had at the time, for a long term even. However, in the late 6th century, Yang Zhang, an ambitious ruler in northern China, he went on a series of military campaigns, and then under his rule, all of China was brought into one centralized imperial rule. And the reason this was a continuity is because after Yang Zhang's dynasty, which was the Sui dynasty, although it survived for 37 years, the tradition that this Sui dynasty created for the Tang dynasty and then later replaced by the Song dynasty completely outlived its house. And from then until less than 200 years ago, China was under centralized rule. So, for most of its history that we know of, it was under centralized imperial rule, which is something that they managed to continue over such a powerful, long period of time. The reason that the spread of Islam was a very prominent theme in Southeast Asia at the time was, well, let's look at India, for example. Let's take them as an example. For several centuries, Islam was had a small presence in Southeast Asia. Nothing much, nothing too major, because the focus was always on Hinduism and Taoism and Buddhism, mainly Hinduism and Buddhism. It was usually in small communities of merchants who were at the ports of the cities that they went to, and it was very low key. However, over time, during the late 13th century, Marco Polo, as you know, a very famous Venetian traveler, he visited the land of Sumatra and he noted that many residents there, even in major cities, there were ruling elites and traders and others who had become interested in the religion due to their many deals with Muslim foreign merchants. And it was no longer Islam on the countryside ports, where it is now Islam in the major cities and towns and the residents there, and their major religions of earlier times, aka Hinduism and Buddhism, those were on the countrysides and the hills, um, and they kept their inherited traditions. With all of this information in mind, one must also keep in mind how Islam was introduced to India, because along with many other things such as goods and ideas being traded around the world, religion was also something that was exchanged through cultures. In a way, this appeal that Islam had was just like many other countries. The Indians in this subcontinent realized that Islam was a way where, if they adopted it properly, could, in hope, improve their position in society, such as Indians. When we look at the caste system, we could realize that Indians, or Hindus that were belonging to Hinduism, of lower caste decided, well, why would I stick to my religion when if I convert, I could escape this discrimination by converting to a faith that actually recognized the equality of the believers that believe in it. So it was something that was appealing to whether it was someone of a lower caste or someone who was dealing a lot with Muslims at ports. It was an appealing religion. Another thing that catalyzed the spread of Islam and the conversion of Islam in this subcontinent, or when looking at Southeast Asia in general, was Sufi missionaries, because for once these mystics weren't actually spreading the religion with its complete details. However, they were focused on just observing rituals and pointing out these doctrines from Islam, where they personally focused on emotional and devotional approaches to God, without completely just forcing the conversion of the religion, which seemed more appealing to people again. So it was very easy going for them, and they were more comfortable converting to it. And along with the Bhakti movement, where you had, in a way, the gap between Hinduism and Islam kept being narrowed down, to, because both religions at the end had many long established cultural traditions. So it was a very appealing movement, the Bhakti movement, but also alongside it, the Sufi missionaries had a very prominent role. To a certain degree, one of the most unique aspects of Darul Islam was the policies that they had for foreigners. Because let's take Baghdad during the Abbasid administration as an example, because I feel like it's the best example because it was the most tightly packed city on the planet at the time during its peak in the Golden Age. In Baghdad, there were people consisting of all different religions, whether Muslims or Christians or Jews or Buddhists. There were there was just a mixture of all sorts of religions found inside Baghdad. And what made this empire so successful in that sense was because they had no oppression to these foreigners. The only thing that could have been different was that they weren't directly in control of the city or of the city states found, and they had to pay a certain foreign tax called the jizya tax. And this was no there was no change seen anywhere else on the planet at the time that was like this, because for once foreigners weren't oppressed, they were praised. It was appealing for them to actually convert, or whether they chose not to, it wasn't a concern. for these people in control, because their main priority was to create an empire that thrived, and this could have only been done through harmony between the citizens. So the foreign policy was something that lasted for a long period of time, over 300 years, with the lasting of the Abbasid dynasty, and this of course affected other empires throughout time. It created a sense of diplomacy and global networks because people realized that if this was the proper way to treat others, we could have they would have succeeded way more. Like, we have to think, there in Europe at that time, it was the Dark Ages, in quotes they called it. Why? Because there was a very high degree of oppression that was actually occurring in many areas of the world, except for Dar es Salaam, which set an example that continued not only through its empire but to our modern day here.